Well, hello, everybody. This is a rare pleasure for me, and I'm sure the City Biz audience is really going to enjoy this. Uh, Debilyn Molineaux is a visionary, an innovator, a storyteller, and an incredible social entrepreneur. Now, many might think I'm just reading that off of a bio, but in full disclosure, I have to say that I know Debilyn extremely well. Uh, Debbie and I met roughly 10 years ago, and we were co founders of an organization called the Bridge Alliance, an organization to help bring about healthy self governance in our nation. So I can speak from experience that those words as you will all find out during this interview, are not just words. Welcome, Debbie Lynn. So great to reconnect with you.
Oh, David, it's so good to see you here today, too. And I can't wait to come visit you in person.
Yeah, that would be wonderful indeed. Well, I have so much to talk to the City Biz audience about your new venture, American Future. But before we do that, I'd like to know a little history about you and what brought you to the democracy reform or healthy democracy or the bridging movement, whatever one might call it. How did that happen in your life? Because I know you didn't do this your entire life.
No, well, I mean, it did start when I was very young, and my parents divorced when I was 2, and there was a conservative family and a liberal family, and I was the child that went in between them. So there's some of that that's just kind of in my blood. But more recently, let's say, I actually ran for political office back in 2003. And it was after having an experience where I just saw how dysfunctional our country had become. And I kind of laugh now about I thought it was dysfunctional in 2003, in a sad way, of course. But I jumped in and ran for office so I could get political experience and really find out from the inside what it was like to run a campaign and run for office. That led me to working with some wonderful people that brought you and I together when we co-founded the Bridge Alliance and started really working on how do we help people communicate when they have different priorities and different feelings about how we should solve certain issues in our culture.
And so this work you do, is it about government? Is it about politics? Is it about people? Well, I should say the work you do. Yeah, let's switch to American Future. Tell
Right,
me
yeah.
how that is connected at all to democracy and what your vision is with respect to that, and how your new venture might help bring our country together.
Yeah, well, and I this is actually a continuation of that what I now call pro democracy work. It was cross partisan when we started it, but given the threats that we see to democracy today, to our system of self governance, one of the things that struck me while I was still working with you at Bridge Alliance was how much, like everyday Americans, number one, didn't think democracy was at risk or assumed it would always be there. And then secondly, they also, if they were younger, they never experienced democracy or democratic republic, if you want to be technically correct. They'd never seen that system of governance actually work, and definitely not work for everyday people. So, given all of that, I was really frustrated by people would wake up, they would think nothing's happening, I have to do something. They would start an organization. And then all of a sudden they would discover us, the people who had already woken up and started an organization. And we ended up with this like plethora, of many people doing great things, which is awesome, but we're still not reaching the everyday American. So a lesson I learned from you was like, what's in it for them? What is in it from everyday citizens that's going to make them think about democracy and their role in it? As a citizen in a democracy, that means self-governance. We have to know how it connects to our day-to-day lives. An American Future is to fill that gap by helping people envision the future they actually want instead of something that's presented to them through media that doesn't really look good. In fact, most of the futures that we see in media today suck. So this effort, go ahead.
If someone from the City Biz audience, and I know many of them care about our country, but they don't know what to do and how to become involved. They're either business folks or the teachers or they're uh, whatever their job might be. And I hear this all the time. There's nothing I can do. The politics is so big. There's so much money. So what can they do? What would you advise them to do?
Yeah, well, and I think that's where what really excites me about the work I'm doing today is that American Future is, in essence, it's an interview to help individuals know what they want for their own future. And it starts with, a simple question of like, when you look at your future self, your older self, what do you want to be proud of? What are you most proud of? And it really helps people identify what's important and helps them then align their life and their choices today to get to that future. Now, in the process of getting to that future, they're going to have to organize and coordinate with some other people. Well, that's democracy, that's self governance. And if you know what your friends and family's future visions are for themselves, you want to support them. And so you're going to start coordinating with them. And then that's another aspect of like just being engaged as a citizen to build the communities that we want for the future.
So I know you've been doing this for roughly a year. I might have the timing off a little. So you've interviewed a lot of people. You've heard a lot of stories. Are there a few that were especially impactful to you that our audience might be interested in that might inspire them?
Yeah, no, and thank you for this. So the pilot project interviewed people across the country. So just to give the City Biz List folks an idea of who they are, the ages ranged from 16 to over 75. They lived in all parts of the country because I actually did a driving tour from the East Coast to the West Coast and back again. And they racially, ethnically diverse, and from a combination of like big cities and more suburban type Midwest cities. Not a whole lot of rural folks in here yet. But one of the stories that has stood out to me was from a young woman, a 20-something woman in Ferguson, Missouri. And her vision for her life in a few years was to become an alderwoman so that she could actually serve the community she currently lived in. And not only that, but what she really wanted to do was to live on what I would call an urban farm, or a suburban farm might be more accurate, and to have a cow. And this was important because for her, it was the embodiment, if you will, of both a nurturing, caring life that she wants to lead, but also a way that she could give back to her community. Another story that I talked with a young man from Los Angeles who's a filmmaker. And he was very deeply concerned about how he was going to meet his future wife and be able to provide for his family. And so we had this lovely conversation. And in the course of that conversation, he realized that he actually wasn't putting himself in a place, physically locating himself in a place where he could meet the future wife he desired. And he had this big vision of being married, having a lot of kids, and also, having a group of friends around them where they could support each other through their lives.
Well, an obvious question our audience might ask is, since you were so involved for so many years on a more macro level, with bigger organizations trying to pass campaign financing reform or ranked choice voting or gerrymandering reform or whatever, the audience might think there's a disconnect, that what you're doing now is not at all related. And I know that's not the case. So maybe some insights for our audience would be helpful.
Sure. Well, I think when we break it down to like the lowest common denominator of any community, any business, any issue orientation that people might have that they're working on together, our basic unit of operation is as a person. And the way that we make things happen in our society is by people working together. Sometimes it's in opposition to other people, which we have more than enough of right now, I might add. So helping people connect both to their own desires and then helping them support the desires of others in their lives is actually a way that we can knit our society, our culture back together again. And it works at small scale, like just you and your family, perhaps, or it works within a company where a company might need to have a different outreach program to inspire young people to do the work, because young people want to align their life mission with their work mission. It's not a separate thing like it was for older generations. So there's a lot of connections on how we help individual people then become self-governing, both of themselves and then within community of other people with whom they're organizing.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I know you well because we worked together so long, and I know you care deeply about our country, and you think our country has serious problems. What keeps you going? How do you remain upbeat and not get down? So many of my friends just feel it's hopeless. There's nothing I can do. It's worse than ever. How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, I have my moments too, where I also am just bereft of what has happened to our country. At the same time, I see a shining light of possibility, because the story that I tell myself is that we are actually at the end of an era in our country. And part of why it's so divisive and why we're fighting so much right now is because we're trying to figure out what the next chapter is. And I personally want this next chapter to be much brighter, more inclusive, have a lot of dignity for every person in our nation. And so what keeps me going is knowing that it's going to be worth it. Once we get through this really hard time that we're in right now, the future, the next chapter that we're writing is going to be worth it.
Well, speaking of the next chapter, I had a personal experience, and if I remember correctly, it was your vision. 2 or 3 years ago, there was an event called JEDI's, Justice, Equity. I think it's Diversity and Inclusion. I could have that wrong.
It was
Uh,
dignity. We put
Dignity, that's right.
dignity
We
in there.
changed
Yeah.
it. Yes, to Justice, Equity, Dignity, and Inclusion. And that was a remarkable event to bring about social cohesion in our society. Uh, that was a deeply moving experience for me. Could you tell our audience a little about what that was about, that brought really diverse uh, people together to do what? What happened there?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah.
Yeah,
Bring back the
bringing you back
memories,
a few
David.
years.
Well, I think part of, as we were looking at the democracy space, and I'll use that term kind of loosely right now, but the organizations that were part of Bridge Alliance, we had an awakening and an awareness that the people that were in our circle of influence, in our sphere and members, ended up being largely white, older, and progressive. Not everyone, there was exceptions to that rule, but by and large, like 90% of the organizational leadership fit into that category. And so you and I started working on an effort to diversify, to bring in more conservatives, to bring in more people of color, to bring in younger people, to bring in geographically diverse people as well, because we also had a lot of coastal elite in our groups. And as that evolved, the JEDI program itself came out of that effort, that DEI effort that we were doing with Bridge Alliance. And the impetus behind it was that there's a lot of stereotypes, if you will, that we can't actually communicate or get to know one another. So working with Dr. F. Willis Johnson, he and I designed a program where, number one, we looked at what was going to be the demographic makeup of the United States in 20 years. And we said, we want to have in the JEDI program that type of diversity. And imagine the future with that type of diversity, which is people of color majority, right? Non-white majorities. And then also have some ideological diversity, have some age diversity, have gender diversity, and a variety of sexual orientations too. And so we put this group of people together. There was 35 of us that met at Omega Institute in upstate New York, who luckily for us granted us this space to do this. And then we spent the next year getting to know one another to see where do we have cohesion, where do we not have cohesion, where's there a rub, and what can we do about that discomfort. And we leaned into the discomfort of of where we are now, and looking at how we can get to that type of a future in a peaceful way.
Well, I personally experienced it, and it was a powerful event. So there's so much to talk about. I don't know whether to talk about the future or the past. I mean, there's a lot of things in the past, but this is a very unusual time we're living in, a very unusual year. And I know you're focused on a longer future thinking, but with this upcoming election, what's going to happen between now and November, between November and January? Does that shift your focus or thinking at all? Do you, or you just stay on a path and not get distracted by the current noise out there?
Yeah, well, I ask myself this question a lot because, and thankfully, there are a ton of people out there doing the short term work for the very next election. I find there's fewer people out there who are thinking into 2026, 28, 30, 32, et cetera. And that's just when you put it in election cycle terms. I like to stay focused on the long term vision and trust that our country, the people in our country, who I've now talked to, a good representative of them, actually want to contribute back to their country, to their communities, and to the people in their lives. So I know that in our hearts, there's a desire to contribute to a better future. And I trust that. Now, are there things that American Future can do between now and the election to be helpful? Absolutely. Working with affinity groups to help them figure out their own future visions for themselves and hold that in a small community, in a small group, so that people start working on that together. That could be a work environment. It could be a book club. It could be a family reunion. Any of those kind of places actually helps us then navigate through the election season better together, where we're not as bothered by what's happening in the media.
So, as you imagine our future, if you're if it became a reality,
Hmm.
how does all the work that we did for a long time on the Bridge Alliance and the work you did before that and the work you're doing now, what difference will that make in everyday lives of Americans? What do you see as the importance of a healthy democratic republic in terms of the everyday life of Americans?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I can identify that would be different for everyday Americans is that they would be taking pride in those things that really matter to us. One thing that I want to note from the interviews I've done is that nobody has said what I'm most proud of is that Trump won the election or that Biden won the election. Nobody's talking about politics when I ask them what they're proud of in their future selves. They're talking about their deep connections to their friends and family. They're talking about the community that they're proud of, that they've contributed to in some way. They're talking about how do we make progress? How do we contribute to a better life for our children? Those are the things that actually matter. And so the impact of what you're doing and what I'm doing is creating ways for people to actually create that for themselves, that self-governance.
Sure. Well, that really strikes a chord with me because I think sometimes, maybe particularly me as a business, math, cost benefit type of person, I think too much in terms of policy and results. But the human stories are key in connecting as humans, and your work has shown that a lot. We really are so similar in so many ways. We're running out of time a little, but I do have this question. I mean, we talked about your early life a little, but when you were a young lady, when you were in grammar school or junior high, was there anything about who you were then that might, you looking back, say that impacted me greatly, and that's why I am civically engaged, and that's why I do the work I do? Or is it something that happened as you grew and later in life, or
Well, I
both?
for politics specifically, it was later in life. I was almost 40. And I was at Omega Institute that we mentioned earlier, and I literally had a vision of what a healthy political system could be. And that vision motivates me to this day because I could feel it in my body how healthy that is. And I just took it as a calling, as a vocational calling, and that's led me to do this work.
Yes. Well, it's admirable work and it's important work. And if anybody in our audience goes to AmericanFuture.us, what should they look for, and how would they be involved, and what's the next step for them?
Well, there's two things. One, I encourage everyone who watches this, you can take this interview yourself. And it's right, a big button on the home screen. It says take the self interview. The other thing to do is to listen to the Terrified Nation podcast, because that also, not only do I talk about how we got here, why we're such a terrified nation today, but I also then interview people in the podcast about what they want for their future. And those stories are just so heartwarming. And so you can actually be inspired by some of those stories that people have shared.
Well, wonderful connecting with you again. It really is a pleasure, and I'm sure a pleasure for our audience as well. So thank you, Debbie Lynn. It's been wonderful. Thank you.